My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. The recent unionization vote at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island signals a dramatic development towards tackling the glaring economic inequality that afflicts 21st century America and New York. As someone who grew up in Brooklyn in the years after World War II, the main driver of the massive middle class growth was the strength of labor unions in an economy dominated by manufacturing, which provided both living wages and immense consumer buying power. Union membership plummeted in the decades since, as business owners sought cheaper labor, whether in anti-union states in the American South and West or overseas. Much of the unionization focus in this nation shifted to the public sector. The numbers are stark. From a peak of around 35% of American workers belonging to unions in the 1950s, the numbers have slumped to just over 10%. And if you remove public sector workers, the number is closer to 6%. And the very nature of work has changed with the technological advancements that have created and sustained the Amazons of the new economy. And the success of recent unionization votes at dozens of Starbucks franchises across the country show it's not just warehouse workers who are embracing unionization as a means to get a bigger slice of the economic pie. That is why the first Amazon warehouse to organize, a union vote in an Alabama warehouse that same day failed, and we're waiting for the results at a second Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, is so significant. In New York, we've seen unionization drives in non-traditional areas, including among undocumented workers working as deliveristas or in car washes and the like. We're joined in New York, or via Zoom, by 4 New Yorkers who take part in, study, and observe the changing face of work and labor as we move deeper into the 21st century. Stephanie Luce is a professor of labor studies at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, whose work is focused on low-wage workers and the kinds of labor community coalitions that were evident at Amazon. Richard Steyer, for decades, was the editor-in-chief of The Chief Leader, New York's labor-focused newspaper. Virgilio Aran, a Hunter College graduate and currently a graduate student at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, has been involved in union drives for many of those emerging sectors. He's the co-founder and former executive director of the Laundry Workers Center and is currently a national organizer at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. As an undergrad, he participated in the CUNY Model New York State Senate Session Project. And Claudia Irizaria Ponte is a reporter for thecity.nyc, which if you do not read it regularly, you should, who has both covered the Amazon union vote and the recently settled contract negotiations involving doormen and supers at apartment buildings. And apropos of our discussion today, Claudia and her colleague Josefa Velasquez were just nominated for an investigative reporting award by the James Beard Foundation for their stories on attempts by deliveristas to organize for better pay and working conditions. Claudia, let me start with you. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Set
me.
the stage for this. You covered Amazon. We had an existing union through a very tough negotiation that, as many negotiations do, resolved at the last second. And you've been covering deliveristas. There's a changing mood. There's a changing acceptance. Is this a resurgence? Is it a turning point?
More than a turning point, the Amazon unionization vote, I think it proves that we who observe labor history and labor here in the U.S. really don't know anything. This really throws the whole rule book out the window when you have, for the first time really since Reconstruction, a warehouse, a workplace of this size, nearly 9,000 eligible workers, with virtually zero resources against one of the wealthiest, largest, most powerful, influential companies in the world, win by a decisive margin in a labor election with a brand new union, not affiliated with any larger system. I'm not ashamed to say that I personally did not see the ALU's win coming. I feel like there are very few people who, thought that they had an actual chance, especially after the Bessemer vote in Alabama. With the RWDSU last year, resulted in Amazon winning. Of course, the results of that election are contested, and the results of yet another election earlier this year that is also now being contested. I think this is a watershed moment in American labor history, not just because of Amazon, but as you mentioned, Starbucks workers. We had the Fight for 15 last year. We have taxi drivers and Uber and Lyft drivers, and of course the DoorDash and Uber Eats delivery workers, known here in New York as the deliveristas. I feel like observers and historians many years from now will see the pandemic as a potential turning point for this moment, where you have a workforce that is beaten down and worked up, that has seen wages frozen for a generation. Really, I'm part of that generation that perhaps hasn't really known financial stability, high inflation, wages haven't gone up. Meanwhile, student loans are more expensive. The prices of homes keep going up, and rent and all of these things, and are really just arming up and fighting against that within their own workplace and trying to level the playing field. And I think that the victory of the Amazon labor union is just the latest and most dramatic example of that.
Stephanie, part of what she referred to is the changing nature of work. This is a time of globalization. Manufacturing could be moved overseas. You can't move warehouse workers. You can't move retail workers. Is historically the pendulum shifting?
Well, it's interesting to see that, another thing in the pandemic we saw was an increase in strikes even in manufacturing and in the private sector. In 2018, 2019, we saw huge strike waves amongst teachers, and we thought, well, that's because they can't move schools. But we're also seeing people strike at Kellogg's and, other kinds of manufacturing that could move. So I think part of what you're getting at is there is a changing nature of work. We're seeing people fight back in places that are not traditional, but even in traditional workplaces, there's a sense of we're not going to take this anymore. We were put it all on the line during the pandemic. We were willing to risk our lives and come in unsafe conditions. But our bosses weren't coming in and they weren't risking their lives. And also they're making a lot of money and we were not. And we're being asked to take concessions and give back now. And so what I think is interesting is just seeing that level of fight back kind of across the spectrum right now.
Virgilio, in New York City, we've had significant labor activism among deliveristas within the home healthcare industry. There was reference made to Uber. Uber tries to define their employees as contractors, not as employees, which I think you see in the home healthcare industry, so that we don't treat them as workers. Therefore, we don't have to deal with labor laws. But there's also the factor, especially in this city, of undocumented workers and how they, because of their status, can actually organize to further their own economic interests.
So one of the things that we have seen, and first, thank you so much for having me, but one of the things that we have been seeing in this, basically among the immigrant community, that they have been different way of organizing. And, you have restaurant workers and, organizing in non-traditional institution per se, like what we call traditional labor union, but organizing so much among worker centers, especially those workers who has been historically excluded, like domestic workers, like nannies and house cleaner, or even in the laundromat industry. What I think that what we have seen lately, basically in New York City, but outside of even New York City, it is a wave that pick up. I call it this time like a wave that pick up, that in part has to be a lot with the pandemic. And the fact that people were going to work, they were calling essential workers. And the society basically, and the employer, they were like, we need you to produce, but we will not pay you, or we will not consider you to pay you the salary that you, for what you produce. And I think so that, that open an anger of people saying we need to do something to organize and to improve our working condition. So you have seen that pick up, and you have seen with the Liberistas who have been organizing prior to the pandemic to pick up more during the pandemic. You have seen also, in the case of the Amazon workers in Staten Island, or even with domestic workers, basically calling essential workers, saying you need to come to work but we will not pay you what you deserve to be paying. And that has been taken, I think, so that the pandemic opened another door that we haven't seen. I was talking with someone on Sunday in a rally. I was saying my mother was part of those workers. My mother has been working for 40 years. And if you ask her, do you want to retire? I will not retire. I will work until I die. I will work until 70 years. And then she basically went last year in 2020. She went for 2 months without working. And what she found was like, oh my God, I've been working for 44 years. I never realized how much I was exploited, and I need to retire. So she's going to retire in next month. She's going to be retired in May, when she didn't think in that way. So in the same way that my mother took that time because of the pandemic, like we have like a forced lockout, national lockout and global lockout, basically for the first time, in that sense that she basically starting to realize this is how much I'm being exploited, or I'm not being paid what I deserve. Workers are starting also to realize we need to organize to leverage that power. And this one is one of the ways that we're seeing basically coming as a result of the pandemic. And there were other ways, like it's something that is very important. Like we have seen like a teachers, movement of organizing in universities. We see Occupy, but what we have seen as a result of the pandemic, from a personal viewpoint, we haven't seen in a while. And it's a different what we call a different feeling that workers are having on the ground about like I know what I deserve, and I need to leverage the power that I have through the process of organizing.
Richie, you've spent you spent a long time in your career looking at unions, and part of the counterattack from management, from companies, you see it right now at Amazon saying, we don't need a third party. We can have, a relationship, directly employee to management. We don't need this outside agent interfering in our relationship. But you also see among the workers at Amazon, they were aggressively independent of any existing union. The Teamsters came in to help. There are questions, are the Teamsters going to try to gobble them up, to give them heft? I don't mean that in a negative way. But the fact that these are independent unions, and that a lot of workers view the unions, when unions are around long enough, unions can become their own bureaucracy you have to deal with. How significant is it that this was an independent union? And is there some sign going forward that we should be looking at?
It is significant. It was something where actually the ALU was knocked out of its initial bid for representation election last year because it didn't have sufficient petition signatures. And there were people who thought that that was an indication that Chris Smalls didn't understand that you wanted to get 50% signatures rather than getting 30%, which is the minimum that the National Labor Relations Board requires before it will convene an organizing or a representation vote. And basically what happened was that he simply did not let that defeat stop him, that he persisted. And one advantage that he had, which the RWDSU did not have down in Bessemer, was that he was part of the framework of Amazon. He had worked there going back to 2015 and had moved to a mid-level position, a supervisory position. He knew an awful lot of the people who he was attempting to organize at JFK 8. And so that was a real advantage in terms of people trying to talk you off and saying, you don't need an outside party. One of the reasons was because Amazon, in its arrogance, had basically made him into a kind of folk hero when it fired him a couple of years ago because he led a walkout because of unsafe conditions. They said that he was not properly observing social distancing and the other protocols they had set up. His response was, what protocols? The reason we were walking out was because it was unsafe there, that you would have someone who would come in, say she was sick, she had been surrounded by other workers, and they were doing nothing to check those workers' health, to do anything about cleaning up the situation. And it's one of those situations where in terms of the point that Virgilio was making about essential workers, but we don't really care about you and we're not going to treat you that way when it comes to either salary or working conditions. I mean, that was a big factor in terms of the situation here, that you see it with the deliveristas also, that the danger that was inherent in riding bikes through New York traffic, in the same way that working in the kind of close quarters that Amazon insisted on people working in. It's like people were saying, I may need this to make a living, but I don't have to risk my life in order to continue working and be treated decently.
I was going to say another factor related to that we haven't really raised is the pandemic put a lot of lives at risk. And we also saw the movement for Black lives. A lot of Black workers were at risk. They're not just by police violence, but in the workplace. And I think that that's a really important factor as well as the pandemic. There's a huge upsurge in anger and rage about saying we will not be putting our lives on the line anymore for, whether it's at police violence or to make a profit, you're putting our lives on the line. And so I think a number of the organizers, both in Bessemer and in Staten Island, have said that that was part of, what motivates them is a sense of, it's time to fight back. We just can't sit by anymore.
You also have, and I don't know who wants to jump in on this, but we have, we're seeing it now with the war in Ukraine disrupting supply chains, that in a globalized economy, there's moves now to try to bring manufacturing back to this country. Biden has a whole Build It in America. President Biden has a whole Build It in America thing, which is very appealing to unionized workforces in those manufacturing sectors, which are in fact unionized. But the economy has changed. I mean, the nature of work is different. I don't know who wants to jump in on this, so please.
Well, I see there's a real danger there between a nationalist orientation to production, because I think as workers, we need to be working with other workers around the planet. It's workers around the world who are at mercy of these corporations that are hopping from country to country and pitting us against one another. And so I think, corporations have been doing this for the last 30, 40 years, is moving jobs around the globe. Jack Welch really said it, what he wanted to do is have factories on barges and move them to where wages are lowest, and making workers compete against one another. And under that model, workers are losing and losing and losing. So I think workers need to band together and stop that model, stop corporations from a race to the bottom. But the way that they have set this up has made themselves vulnerable. They've set up these very fragile supply chains that can go down at any minute. We saw that not just with the war, but the pandemic in general. If there's a shutdown in a certain country because there's a lockdown, suddenly, no one has cereal or toilet paper. So, it has exposed that workers have a lot more power in these very sensitive supply chains.
The other part, just to jump on that is very important about international solidarity also, and something that is critical in the labor movement. It is to recognize about what company has been doing, which Stephanie highlighted, but also at the same time how workers has been also building solidarity, not just locally, but building solidarity outside of their region, connecting with the struggle with other workers in different countries, and connecting also with workers in your own community, the Amazon workers, the deliveristas, domestic workers. It is not just, the fight is not just pertaining to the workplace, being encircled in the workplace, or what we see in Alabama, but it's pertaining to the whole community and how you can connect. So, breaking with a tradition that some unions took for a while, which is we will just focus in the workplace and our own fight or turf, rather than building a more wider social labor movement. And that's something that unions and workers center and other organization has been picking up and doing very critical exchanges. We're working in South Asia, we're working in Latin America, we're working in other countries to build that solidarity.
Claudia, one way in which the Amazon situation is similar to much older union organizing, going back to the 1930s, the industrial unions, the craft unions, is that it's physically tied to a place. It's a warehouse. People have to go in, they have to process the stuff and move it out. That's not the case with the deliveristas. That's not the case with Uber and Lyft drivers, where the companies try to say, you're not a worker, you're a contractor. Therefore, I don't have to worry about, minimum pay, and I don't have to worry about, this is all about the changing, technology has changed the nature of our lives in so many ways, including work. Are people, and looking in particular at the deliveristas, even setting aside the immigration status issues, is that changing nature of work, changing the nature of labor organizing?
I believe so. And you would be surprised. I was certainly surprised to learn just how much these workers talk to each other. That delivery workers tend to stay in one area of the city or in one neighborhood. And there are several other delivery workers who stay in that area. They become a familiar face and they start talking to each other and agitating each other. And then, of course, one thing that we haven't mentioned yet is the role that social media plays in all this.
Absolutely, yes.
You live with fellow workers. They're your neighbors. You see them on the street when you're delivering in the West Village or to hungry power lunch corporate workers in downtown Manhattan. And you see these workers enough and you see them in the same spot where you charge your bike in the afternoons, and you start talking to them, you exchange phone numbers, you add them to the group chat, and these conversations start happening. That's certainly what started happening with the delivery workers 2 years ago at the onset of the pandemic, and even a little bit before. One quirk about these workers is that a lot of them, share not just a common background as indigenous workers from Central and North America, namely Mexico and Guatemala, but they also live in the same neighborhood. They all found that they lived in an area of Bensonhurst known as Pequeña Guate. So, they started seeing their neighborhoods around there, and they just started talking to each other. Again, social media playing a huge role. And I think we can see the role that technology, and again, just run-of-the-mill solidarity, boots on the ground organizing played here, and how that can be replicated in other kind of like gig economy industries.
Richie, you were talking about how the Amazon company reacted and kind of created their own mess, and how they dealt with Mr. Smalls, who was the lead organizer of the Amazon labor union. And we're waiting to hear what happens in the vote in the Staten Island warehouse. So we don't know how that's the second Staten Island warehouse that, we're waiting to see what that unionization voted. But it was telling that Amazon is very aggressively, and they're not the only management that does that, campaigning for a no vote. It's not like they're doing it surreptitiously, they're doing it overtly, which raises the question of what kind of a counterattack this unionization movement can have. And you can't move your job to Tennessee, which is a right to work state. You can't move your warehouse, you can't move your franchise. So, do you anticipate a counterattack? Of course you do. It's already going on, but what might that look like? What do you think about that?
Basically, it will look a lot like what they did initially, both at Bessemer and in Staten Island, in terms of these captive meetings where they are telling people about all the bad things that can happen if a union comes in. They can tell them that their jobs could be lost. They will threaten that we can build another warehouse somewhere else, or we can simply move the jobs to a warehouse out of state where you're not going to want to go to relocate. So you could lose everything that you have from us. They will do whatever they can in terms of getting sympathetic media to write stories on their behalf. There was a column by Steve Kuzo in the Post a couple of weeks ago talking about how horrible the unions are and what they meant in terms of making the city bankrupt and hurting the country. And it would, it's an alternative reality in which nobody reflects on the fact that basically this began with Ronald Reagan busting out a public employee union, the air traffic controllers, in 1981, which basically was a signal to private employers that it was fertile territory. If you wanted to get tough with labor, you could drive them out, that you did not have to make concessions to them. It's not a coincidence that the imbalance in income has coincided with the period starting in the Reagan era, where the compensation for chief executives is so far beyond what it once was in comparison to their employers that it's a scandal.
Employees, yeah. It was always supposed to be like 25 to 1, and it's now 500, 1,000 to 1. I mean, it's an absurd, they are absurd. But even beyond, even beyond Amazon, I've been following some of the stuff going on in Uber, and they had this fight in California, I think, with, do you define them as employees? Do you find them as contractors? Let me ask Stephanie about this.
Right. So this battle is going on state to state. New York had a bill pending in the legislature last year. It was taken back, but it's going on in Massachusetts. It's going on in a number of states where Uber and Lyft are, in some cases, building alliances with some parts of the labor movement to say, we'll push through legislation that will keep workers as independent contractors. It'll allow them to join a union, but the union will perhaps be defined by the company. It'll be, a lot of people that oppose this are saying these are company unions, but it will set, they're trying to say, we'll give you some benefits, we'll give you a wage floor and so forth, but in return, you're going to stay as independent contractors and you're going to have the right to join a union that's approved by the company. So it's controversial.
One of the things we were talking about before the show is how there are ancillary benefits to even having a union drive. The company might try to buy you out of voting yes for a union. They might try to give you more benefits. They might try to give you a higher wage just so they can, basically retain the ability to fire you and move you, and that can be effective. I don't know if you've seen any of that in Amazon. I don't know, but it's. Go ahead, Virgilio. Were you going to say something?
No, I said like companies will utilize basically the tool to, let's call it by their name, to bust the union, to trying to take out the union, and some of those tactics will be trying to buy it I think that was in Alabama, that the case that was about when Amazon was telling to the employees, to the workers, if you join the union, you would be losing some of those benefits. That very clear violation under the law. I think so that it's very important to sometimes we make in the labor movement the mistake or just seeing in the U.S. Labor just through the lens of traditional labor union, and not realizing that there is a movement also that is happening with workers who were left out from the historical, labor law, like the National Labor Relations Act, who are domestic workers who are doing outside of the union, or the definition of traditional labor union organizing, or farm workers also, and other workers, we mentioned the liberista or tip workers or restaurant worker. It is very clear, the Amazon example, the beautiful about the Amazon example and other campaigns, it is that it came to the conclusion always that the power is in the workers when the workers organize. And we cannot forget about that. When workers build the power, it's very difficult to break out. And it is not about, and when also at the same time, the bureaucracy of the traditional union, it is being cleared out, that allowed the workers to basically maximize all their potential of the organizing power that they have. And I think so that it's something, it's a good example always to take into consideration in some of the victories that we have been seeing lately in the labor movement.
And to your point, Virginia, I would just like to add, I believe this is a point that Stephen Greenhouse actually wrote about. I forget if it was in The Atlantic or The Guardian, but the fact of the matter is, at least in Amazon and in Starbucks, definitely is the case that the old playbook, union busing playbook, hasn't been working. It hasn't been phasing these workers. Starbucks leadership change, the CEO stepped out, Howard Schultz stepped back in, spending millions of dollars to lose 2, I believe, out of the 32 elections so far. Just a devastating and frankly embarrassing loss to the consulting class and to Starbucks corporate. And same with Amazon. Amazon spent $4 million combined on the most recent Amazon election and JFK8 earlier this month. JFK8, of course, winning by a resounding margin. And then Bessemer, the results of that election are still being contested. Amazon won by a much narrower margin than it did last year, I believe about 100 votes, but there are 400 ballots being contested. Of course, the results of that election are still TBD, but the workers can certainly, claim victory of the fact that more people are joining, more of their fellow workers are joining this movement. And of course, that these corporations and the consulting class certainly have an egg in the face.
I'm sorry, Claudia, when you talk about Starbucks, Starbucks are franchises. It's not a central management. One of the benefits of franchising is you limit your corporate liability, but you also can say, there's no massive Starbucks industry. You can't do industry-wide organizing. You have to do it store by store, franchise by. There's an economic structure that on the one hand retards the ability to organize widely, but also means you can pick off a lot of individual, and there's a significant number of individual franchises, which then presumably encourage other franchises. So it's is there a sense that the structure of the economy, I mean, Virgilio's talking about organizing the, deliveristas, and, a lot of those people are paid in cash. Because of the nature of their economic existence. How do you organize people who aren't part of the regular banking system? I don't mean this disrespectfully. I mean this as a sense of economic reality.
And it's a good, what you brought is a good point. And there is a different way that people has been realizing and organizing the power that they have. Let me just begin by saying this. In the way that historically we have seen, we have been boxed, and the labor movement and organizers for many years were boxed into the notion that in order to build power, you had to go in through an institution called the National Labor Relations Board, have per se an election, and then has to be following different procedure. And it's an amazing box that we were historically framework, and what we have seen in organizing, and myself being involved in organizing domestic workers, it is that domestic worker has been basically, as Claudia mentioned, in the case of the Liberista, they know in a region, they know in their community, they have been able basically to challenge the power of the structure, organizing through social media, through in person, through bus stop, the area where the bus stops, basically, and leverage that power and basically negotiating their own salary. And then collectively, when the groups growing in numbers, like something that we have in New York and now in New Jersey, basically, changing laws that benefit them. Like a good example has been domestic workers organizing in order to be included and protected as other workers, what we call in the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the Domestic Bill of Rights, that provide different type of protection to domestic workers who historically were excluded from basic labor laws. And you have in the case of the Liberistas, or you can have the case not just of the Liberistas, but restaurant workers who basically have been able to organize, being undocumented. And it's very important to highlight that if you are undocumented, doesn't mean that you cannot organize. And basically realizing the power that they have in the process of production and saying, we will not work until we get this type of benefits. So that's something that we have to be able to look like not just being framed about this one is the only way that we can be able to organize, but there are multiple ways to organize. The last thing that I want to say about union, and it's always an advice. I always get striking. I'm coming from Latin America and being in other countries, seeing the process of organizing. I always get striking that big labor unions, when they have a National Labor Relations Board election, and they get 45% of the people who voted for it, then yes, and they abandon because they didn't win that particular part, rather than staying there in the place, you get 45%. Why you continue getting in that 45% is a big number. Why you don't stay there and continue building in their power in that community until you get to the number that you want to, and continue organizing rather than abandon. And that's something that in a humble way, I think that American U.S. labor union leaders and representative organization has to see different way of organizing in other countries and how they can be able to build leverage in a more difficult environment than in the U.S.
We're going to
I
go
think
to.
that there has been some evolution in terms of larger labor unions' perspective, in terms of a lot of these employees, that it's something 30 years ago, you had a strike at the Rainbow Room by workers there, immigrant workers for the most part, Latino. You had electricians who were working at NBC, where the Rainbow Room was located, who were crossing the picket line, and the striking workers would plead with them not to cross the picket line. They would laugh at them. What was really embarrassing about this was that the head of the Central Labor Council, the umbrella group for public and private sector unions, Tom Van Arsdale, was also the head of the Electrical Workers Union. And he rationalized this, saying, do you want them to be replaced by non-union electricians? That's what they'd be risking. When he should have been doing everything in his power just to save face, shutting things down. That you would not see that happen these days with the Central Labor Council. There is much more of an awareness. There is much more of a sense of reality in terms of fighting battles that have to be fought. And it's something you could see it even in terms of the Fight for 15. When the Fight for 15 first began in New
Fight
York,
for 15, that
Cuomo
for a,
pronounced it dead on arrival. He basically called it a pipe dream, literally. And he wound up being caught up in the wave that was being led by union leaders like Hector Figueroa from Local 32 BJ, where you would have thought that he was the guy who was leading the push for it all the time. And they were able to get a deal within a couple of years on that. That it's something that large labor unions, even if they're not involved in something like Amazon, they are fully aware of the significance of a victory like the one at the first Staten Island warehouse, that there is no longer this sense of they don't look like us, they don't speak the same language as us, and therefore it's not really our fight. They are aware that long-term survival in the labor movement depends upon people being unified.
I'm going to take questions.
The first question today comes from Menachem Mueller of Brooklyn College. He is a Caucus CUNY scholar in the office of Assemblymember Uline New. He asks, how should the labor movement respond to problems like automation?
Boy, that's a very interesting question, and it has, it's an automation question, a globalization question. Stephanie, I think this is your bailiwick.
Sure. Well, workers have been facing the threats of automation since the beginning of capitalism. That's what has always gone on for hundreds of years, and it's not going to change. And the question is, it's about power. In most cases, technology can be really good for workers. It can prevent us from doing dangerous jobs. It could be good for communities. The question is, who gets to decide which technologies we adopt and how? And some of the stronger unions have done that. They've carved a role for themselves in negotiating over how technologies are adopted. And so what we want to do, you can imagine it with Zoom. We could all have a collective bargaining situation where teachers and students together with staff decide, when do we use Zoom, when do we not, when do we meet in person, when do we not, in a way that doesn't cut jobs and works for the benefit for everyone. So I don't think automation is the fear. I think power is the question.
Well, except automation is also, at some point, we're talking a lot about the changing nature of work. At some point, reality bites you in the butt, and that is the reality. When I was in graduate school, I went to Rutgers Graduate School, I worked on the assembly line at a Ford plant in Metuchen, putting door pads and window cranks on the left side of 405 Pintos and Mustangs a night. I do remember that. A lot of that work is done by robots now. Yeah. And the UAW is a very powerful union, but even very powerful unions, in the face of the changing nature of work, as we're talking a lot about, they have to be nimble in how they adjust. I don't know who, Claudia, are unions nimble enough to react to the changing economy?
I think that remains to be seen, as Stephanie was talking about. It really does depend more than on the unions, on the workers themselves and how they're able to exert their power in this moment of such tumult and change.
There's a degree, Richie, I want to ask you this. There's a degree that that labor organizing in the 1930s was essentially conservative. that it was a way of saying, I want to protect my job because the bosses were saying, I can dump you out the door and replace you tomorrow because there's mass unemployment. That it was protection against, it was, giving yourself some agency, some power to resist the fact that there were millions of people unemployed who would take your job in a heartbeat. Now we have a bit of we have a very tight labor market, which I think is also factoring in, but you also see things like if you work over 30 hours a week, your employer, because of Obamacare, your employer has to provide you health care. And so, especially in the retail sector, we're talking about the, organizing the Starbucks workers, how many of those people are kept just below 30 hours so they don't have to? So, how bosses react to this new, they're pretty skilled too.
They are. And one of the big questions for the Amazon labor union is how long is it going to take them to get a contract now that they've gotten the right to bargain a contract, that Amazon can be counted on to delay as long as possible. They are already doing that by challenging the outcome of the vote and claiming that the NLRB itself committed violations that should lead to the result being set aside. But it's not confined to a place like Amazon with a guy named Bezos who, is richer than Croesus, but does not want to have to pay his workers a decent wage. That Columbia University took about 5 years after graduate assistants there were organized before they finally got around to negotiating a contract. That this is the unfortunate thing that even people who are in charge of what you'd think of as progressive institutions tend to get very conservative when it comes to dealing with unions. On the other hand, a guy who I knew whose organizing went back to the Ladies Garment Workers Union in the 40s and 50s once said to me, the bosses are the best organizers we've got. And what he meant by that was that if you make conditions repressive enough, if you treat people without much respect, you're going to wind up doing the union's organizing work for them in terms of getting enough people angry to actually look to take action on their own behalf.
Virgilio, again, to come back, I think we've touched on this, but again, the changing nature of work. Deliveristas don't work for one restaurant. They work off of apps and they respond. I was actually in the cab drivers union at one point, and you're trying to, work, you're trying to work with your other cab drivers, but you're also trying to beat their brains out to beat them for a fare. So, and so there, but, there is some competition, within the deliverista world, but there's no central place that they go to work. And you see that with home health care workers, there is where, they're sent out one by one, which doesn't lend itself to solidarity. And I would presume makes it a greater challenge to organize.
Yes, you are completely right. And one of the reasons, for instance, why major in the case of domestic workers, major labor union didn't try to attempt to organize domestic workers is basically by the structure that you defined. It's not a centralized place. In the case of domestic workers, it's a one-to-one relationship, basically. So therefore, the structure or the nature of organizing based on the nature of the industry, it is completely different to what you see potentially in Amazon or in a hotel, organizing a hotel. And that's why in the case, like the way that the National Domestic Workers Alliance and different organizations overcome those challenges was basically by, doing or elaborating or developing different type of tools outside of the traditional box of organizing. For instance, like a good example of that, it is providing different type of services, which potentially, if the majority of the workforce in a particular city are from a foreign country, let's say mostly Spanish speaker, providing services that connect them or that help them to navigate in the United States. And that's how, in some cases, like a worker center in many of our cities, New York City, for instance, came to emerge. Like it was not just just came to know more about your workplace, but came because there are different type of services that will help you. And then basically through that, doing what we call political education and organizing and connecting to their job. Other tactics has been, as we mentioned, because it's not a centralized place, but we can be able to see as an organizer where domestic workers potentially gather, like in areas where there is high density and people take the bus or take the train, speaking to them, speaking then to domestic workers and speaking about like how they're negotiating those one-on-one relationship. And then came something that is very important, like we are not machine, we're human beings. So there is something of necessity of building that social network. And we talk about social media, but also like how social media help also to keep ourselves in connection and exchanging basically our own story of what is happening. And that's something that in the case of a challenging industry to organize like the domestic worker has been able to build this their own network basically because they are facing isolation, basically because they are in one particular place called workplace, the home, and the relationship is one-to-one. So they communicate, they build this network in which they go into a park and they basically eat each other lunch, or in a library where they gather together in the summer or in the winter, and they build the network that keep them to that help them to keep in touch and that help them to basically exchange ideas about what condition they are facing and also how they can overcome those conditions. So that has been tool that we have been able to develop in some of the non-traditional industry that union have historically organized, in which you have a more centralized workplace, like a warehouse, a hotel, or auto industry.
Let me go to another question.
The second question is from Yamila Mercado, who is from Hunter College and is a Caucus CUNY scholar in the office of Senator Robert Jackson. What policies can companies adopt to protect themselves from labor claims, for example, protests, strikes, boycotts by workers and unions?
I can answer that one because I lived myself through that one. So the legal system at this moment they will develop. They don't have to they're having an attempt in the work. For instance, I came from worker center and union. So the worker center, we have what we can conduct secondary pickering. Unions are not allowed to conduct secondary pickering. So basically, so means that, for instance, that if an employer has a relationship with another vendor, we can go and pickering the vendor. Basically, they're having an attempt by conservative lawmakers, basically to labor worker center as a union, which means that will basically prevent even worker centers to conduct that. They can file an injunction, so that will protect them to, if you're protecting, that will stop you from protecting. And they use other tactics, such as they can sue you. So we were having a campaign, the Laundry Worker Center was having a campaign in the Bronx against a restaurant, and the restaurant owner sued us because of defamation. And then he sued us under RICO, which basically is a law that—
It's a racketeering
we won
law.
the case. It's a
racketeering law.
Racketeering, yes. We were like a mob or a mafia, even though he was stealing the wages and sexually harassing the workers.
I don't want to. We don't know how much time left. I want to ask this to Stephanie, and it's going to lead into a question to Claudia. You've done work about how community organizing around that, in particular low-wage workers, where there's kind of an empathetic heart would lead you to support them. How important is that in the kind of work that Virgilio is doing? Did we see that in Amazon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, community support can play a big role in supporting labor struggles because, the work that I've done around living wage, minimum wage campaigns, a lot of that is actually driven by, 80, sometimes 60 to 80% of the population wants the minimum wage to go up. Even among Republican voters, it's a popular issue. It's not enough just to have community support, but it can make a big difference. When workers go on strike, they often historically have relied on community support to do things like give a strike fund, right, to help workers stay out on strike, provide food and provide shelter, to get through the tough times. They can influence letters to the editor. They can influence their legislators. And so those kinds of alliances are really important. And what we're seeing in the labor movement is going beyond just a, one-way relationship to more a inclusive relationship into which, unions also are turning around and saying, we're going to incorporate in our bargaining community demands. Like teachers saying, we want to incorporate demands for students so that students have smaller class sizes and so forth. And so, or janitors and environmentalists working together against companies that are polluting and treating the janitors poorly. So we're seeing more and more a move where labor unions and community groups, churches and faith-based groups together, students, are saying we have common interests. Amazon affects us all in all these different ways as consumers, as workers, and as environmentalists, as immigrant rights, And I think that's kind of the most hopeful direction that we're seeing in the labor movement as these alliances grow.
Claudia, where do we go from here? I mean, this is, and Richie is right. The fact that there was a successful vote at the union doesn't mean you have a contract. That doesn't mean that, the pressure is going to be on them to not make, on the union, not to make too many demands because it's very important to get a first contract. So, I mean, there's a lot of countervailing forces going on. But what does this mean? What are you looking at to see where this fever might spread?
I feel that time will tell. I know that that's the lame answer, but as Virgilio and Richard and Stephanie have noted, the major challenge now for the union, for ALU, really is securing a contract. Winning the election was the easy part. Ratifying the election is the next hurdle, and the real challenge is actually securing a contract. Whether they are successful in that endeavor, and then of course it's worth noting that we actually haven't mentioned yet that the other Staten Island warehouse, LDJ5, is having their election right now. It started on Monday. The vote starts counting next Monday, May 2nd, the day after May Day.
The day that this appears, the day that this show first appears. Okay.
Yeah.
Go.
And, the results of not just the LDJ5 election, but of course, whatever happens in the bargaining negotiations of Amazon will really mark if this is a turning point in the labor movement. I believe it already is. And in terms of the delivery workers and Starbucks workers, these workers can already claim a tremendous victory. They have a friendly media. At least here in New York, delivery workers have already won certain gains through the city council regulating the industry. They have the attention of a friendly Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, of course, a senator from New York. And more broadly speaking, not just for Starbucks, Amazon workers, and the deliveristas, we have the friendliest president to labor in frankly, more than a generation, and Joe Biden, who has spoken in favor of Amazon workers and their plight, who is pushing for the PRO, or Protect the Right to Organize Act, and pushing for these broad labor reforms in this country in a way that we really haven't seen in many decades. So whether the legacy of Joe Biden will stick and of these movements will stick, will tell. But I think that the working class can already claim a tremendous victory with these three struggles that we're seeing right now.
Richard,
The other component is ultimately how the Democratic Party reacts to the developments around it. That it's something that, as Claudia basically alluded to, Barack Obama did not deliver in terms of promises he'd made to labor, that the PRO Act was something that he had said campaigning in 2008, you bring me that bill after it's passed Congress, I will sign it. A year or two into his presidency, he basically let Congress know that he had bigger priorities and that one was one that was just going to have to sit. And it's something that ultimately Democrats have to realize, that one reason that Trump became attractive to some of their members was because they felt that the Democratic Party had not produced for them. They felt that Hillary Clinton was closer to Wall Street than she was to working people, something she did not do enough to discourage over the course of that campaign. That Democrats have to accept the reality that if they are not viewed by workers as being very much in their corner, if they are seen as people who are just looking for people who are better off or better educated, then there is not a real strong reason for them, other than the fact that the Republicans are bad, to come out and vote for the Democrats.
Of
And that's
course.
going to be a big factor in the elections this year in the midterms.
Yeah, but you and I pay a lot of attention to politics, Richie, and you know it's obvious that the culture war, the cancel culture, is that when you can't convince somebody on economic issues, you play the race card, and it's the issue of dividing people by race. It was so there is a sense that the Democrats have been trapped in identity politics, if you will, that the Republicans have now mastered them on in appealing to kind of a white working class that if they, looked at their economic interest, might have a different point of view. We only have 30 seconds left, Stephanie. What should we be looking at going forward? Literally, we have 25 seconds left.
The world is on fire right now, and I think that it can go in either direction, but the momentum seems to be on behalf of the workers, and I think that's where we want to be with.
I think one of the problems always is that, progress is not linear, that there's 2 steps forward, a step back, sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Right. So I want to thank you all for joining us on CUNY Forum. This is very spirited, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.